Welcome. Hi, Matt.
Hey,
Good morning
Phyllis,
from
great to
sunny
see
Florida.
Not so sunny Toronto, I'll tell you that.
Sunny but very cold
Oh,
Jerusalem.
is it?
It feels as cold as Toronto, Phyllis.
I'm wearing a sweater so I can see.
Actually, when Rabbi got on this morning, he still had his winter hat on.
Oh gosh, I used to love to watch people in Florida wearing their winter stuff when I was down there. Oh my God.
It's 64 degrees, so the jackets are out.
I see.
I feel sorry.
Matt Weiss is bundled up out there.
No,
I feel
I'm
so sorry
outside.
for you. Oh my goodness.
Right.
It's all
That's
good.
great.
All good.
Well, good morning, friends. I know we have a few more people joining us who had RSVP'd. So, we always have a few stragglers coming on. Really delighted to be with you this morning. This is the 8th session of our 8-part series of weekly learning. But as we discussed last week, we are enjoying this, I think, as much as you are. So we're going to go ahead and put another 5 sessions on the calendar for now. And then we'll take a look. Great. We'll take a look at the calendar because we're trying to keep things consistent on Thursday morning. So we'll take a look at that, but you can bet that we'll be here for the next 5 weeks, starting next Thursday. We'll send out an email about that. We also are going to have some new Zoom credentials. So if you have this in your calendar, today will be the last day of this Zoom link. Next week, we'll be on a new station, so to speak. So welcome back. A couple people who missed last week, I think Reva and Matt. And we're ready for some learning. Rabbi Berkowitz, hello.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Boker Tov. Good morning to all of you in North America, and Tzorayim Tovim. Good afternoon from Israel. I want to say Mazal Tov on a new beginning in the United States, on President Biden's inauguration. The privilege of being able to watch the ceremonies yesterday, which were very beautiful. I'm sure all of you were most impressed with the poet, the young poet laureate that spoke, who was just spectacular. So that was, I think, the most inspiring moment. It was very, very beautiful.
And I heard that she has a speech impediment.
I just heard that, Diane.
Amazing.
Unbelievable. Yes. Yeah. And one of the ways that she overcame the speech impediment, apparently, was by memorizing one of the songs from Hamilton that she had difficulty with the sound R and pronouncing R. So it was, one of the songs that kept repeating the R sound, and she just committed it to memory. She said that she was going to overcome this. God bless her. She certainly did.
One of the readers of the, when they were reading during the celebration, and they were reading different parts of, now I'm forgetting what it was they were reading parts of, but the student who read was the little boy who Biden told, he also stuttered.
Yes.
And Biden said, I had a stutter, I conquered it, you can do this.
Right.
And that, I don't know how many takes it took, but that little boy read the whole thing without stuttering one time.
Right, they were
Made me,
portions
I bawled my eyes out yesterday.
yeah, portions of different inauguration addresses.
So once again, I want to welcome all of you. We have many panim mukarot, many recognizable faces in our virtual Beit Midrash again. And we have a new face who I just saw before, but now I don't see. I want to welcome Phil Wax, who is new to our virtual Beit Midrash. So great to have you. There he is. Phil, great to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome.
Looking forward to having you part of this experience. So this week's Parsha is Parashat Bo. And there is plenty that I could have chosen to speak about on Parashat Bo. I'm sure you could probably guess that I was most attracted to talking about Pesach and Rosh Chodesh and the Paschal offering. As somebody who created a Haggadah, that would sort of be my natural direction to go in for this class, but instead I chose a more controversial and perhaps animated topic, and that is the perennial debate over the pilfering that went on the eve of the Exodus from Egypt. And so what I want to do with you over this hour is I want to take a look at the different perspectives related to this particular episode, so that we can see how it is that we understand this very, very shady episode in Israelite history. As you can imagine, I had a lot of fun titling this hour. So you can see at the top of the source sheet, it's entitled Parashat Bo, Reparations or Rapaciousness, the Curious Case of Ambiguous Appropriation. Okay, so that's what we're going to be taking a look at. And as always, I'm going to share the sources on screen. And I know many of you have them in hand as well. So let's turn to the share screen. Okay, I'm going to make the text just slightly bigger. There we go. Whoops.
A little bigger, please.
Okay. A little
Yeah.
bigger. Okay.
Thank you.
Is that good? Okay. So let's jump into the infamous episode. Exodus 12, verses 35 through 36. We read, the Israelites had done Moses's bidding and borrowed from the Egyptians objects of silver, gold, and clothing. And the Lord had disposed the Egyptians favorably toward the people, and they let them have their request. Thus, they stripped the Egyptians. Okay, and in the Hebrew, I want to take a look at the Hebrew, because as we know, every translation is a commentary. So certainly, for those of you who know Hebrew, I want to take a look at that text itself. Uvenei Yisrael asu kidvar Moshe, vayishalu mimitzrayim klei kesef uchlei zahav vismalot, va'Adonai natan etchen ha'am be'enei Mitzrayim, vayashilum vayinatzlu et Mitzrayim. Okay, so that's a narration of the episode that we're jumping off from. And I want to show you the commentary of two non-Jewish Bible academics that show us two very, very different perspectives on how this particular episode is construed. Okay, the first is Brevard Childs, who wrote a classic commentary on the book of Exodus. And here's what he writes. The insertion of the despoiling of the Egyptians adds the final evidence of the utter defeat of the Egyptians. The Israelites do not slink out of the country, but go as a victorious army who has plundered their oppressors. Okay, so how does Brevard Childs understand this particular episode? He relates to this as the spoils of war. Okay, this was the Egyptians against the Israelites against the Egyptians. Justice prevailed, right? The former slaves become free people, and they leave Egypt with the spoils of a war waged against their oppressors. Now, John Durham, in the Word Bible Commentary, says the following. The taking by the Israelites of their Egyptian oppressors' valuables, anticipated in Exodus 3 and Exodus 11, is here reported without elaboration. This despoiling is made possible by God's gift of grace to Israel, an aura of credibility which made the Egyptians trust them and want to give them articles of silver, gold, and clothing. That the Egyptians could so be picked clean is another testimony of God's triumph over Pharaoh and all his gods and wizards. Okay, so what is it that John Durham is saying? Right, he's saying that God gave Israel the gift of grace here. Literally, he's latching on to that word chen, right? He made them look good in the eyes of the Egyptians so that the Egyptians would come forward and give them these gifts. And ultimately, he says that this is a symbol of God's triumph over Pharaoh and over right? The Egyptian gods and wizards. But my question to you is Durham justifying the unjustifiable? Who would like to jump in? Nancy.
I've always had problems with this part of the story. It always struck me as, so you got your freedom and on the way out, you're robbing the house in which you were forced to serve. And it is always to me been sort of well, on the one hand, and this is probably what I was taught. On the one hand, this was repayment for 400 years of slavery. And on the other hand, it's pillage. It's just, we've won, we're going, and now we're taking all of your stuff and we're taking it for ourselves. And it's a very uncomfortable story, part of the Torah. Not us at our best, I don't think.
Excellent. Okay, Shelley.
I don't have the same problem as Nancy does. I feel like these two commentators, I don't even know where I'm looking with this. I'm in front of this computer, so I apologize. But I feel like these two commentators are taking very extreme opinions that I don't feel like either one I agree with. I feel like one is almost like I would accuse Brewer Childs of being, it was almost like an anti-Semitic commentary, in that it appears that the Israelites were like raping a country, where that is not at all what happened. And the other one is too apologetic, that there's too much of a, I think I always learned, and maybe I don't know if I learned based on rabbinical commentary, because when you're young, you don't know what you're learning from, that they wanted them out, and that they had, all of a sudden, they were very much in fear of them, and they gave to them, not because they liked them, not because they respected their God, but because they were fearful of them and wanted them out now. So I feel like both of these commentaries are off the mark.
Excellent, Shelley. Very, very good comments. Steve Finkelman.
The theme about booty, about collecting, is a very common throughout, so I don't think it's derogatory. Even next week's Haftorah, one of my favorite ones, Beshalach, the story of Sisera's mother waiting for him to bring home the booty, not knowing that he's already been killed. But it's a very common, but also I think when you look in the context of the last plagues, where the Egyptians suffered tremendously, including the loss of the firstborns, not because Pharaoh chose it, because God hardened his heart. So we can say God can harden and cause all this harm, of real harm, to the Egyptians through no, quote unquote, no fault of their own, because God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Giving up this property is pretty small compared to losing their firstborns and the other plagues they'd suffered before.
Right. Good. Well said. Look, the notion of taking booty and the spoils of war doesn't fly in the face of Torah. But I believe Shelley's point was the tone in which Brewer Childs writes here. It's interesting. I sort of had the same visceral reaction as I read Childs. And it's certainly known that in the world of biblical criticism, this was definitely, one unfortunate stream that was trying to undermine the chosenness of the Israelites, of the Jewish people. Diane Trotterman.
Hi, I just, nope, I don't think that we even tell our kids about this. I really don't. I never learned that. I never, growing up, we talk about taking that flat piece out of the oven and going. We don't talk about that. So it seems as if the Jewish interpretation just doesn't even wants to remove that particular sentence.
It's true. We would love to be able to ignore this. It's interesting because I actually include this in my Haggadah as a creative idea to weave into the Seder. I forget exactly where it comes from, but there is a diaspora community that would decorate the Seder table with jewels, with gold and silver, right, to recall this particular moment, because it was a way of sparking questions amongst the kids that were sitting around the Seder table. So, I love that idea of, using that to, to get people to ask questions and, even to provoke some debate. Diane Wall.
Yeah, I never was lucky enough to have a background when I was a kid, going to a Hebrew school. That's another whole story. But I'm just curious, or maybe it's so many years later, wasn't all those beautiful jewels and everything that they got eventually their undoing when it came to doing the golden calf and everything? And so many of them thought it was more important to have, the nice shimmering bracelets and everything. And then so many of them were then punished and literally killed by, God. They just never saw
Right.
the future.
Right. So it's interesting, Diane, that, I love that you're connecting both of these episodes. So perhaps, that's Etzbe Elohim, that's the finger of God in all of this, right? Here you unjustly, in a way, despoiled the Egyptians on your way out, right? So maybe this is, we could think of Egel HaZahav, the golden calf, as the payback for, or the retribution for what went on there. Because after all, it was presumably these riches that were used. Larry Goldberg.
It's interesting, regardless of how you look at this, it sort of seems that God is very complicit in all of this. The line is, the Lord disposed the Egyptians favorably toward the people. So if this was a feint of some sort, God kind of set it all up. So however you see it, I would probably tend to agree with Shelley that the Egyptians were so tired of these people that was sort of like, here, take whatever I have, get out of here. We're tired of all these plagues, and clearly, I guess the plagues and everything else sort of set it all up. But it appears that God is a bit complicit in whatever happened, however you see it.
Excellent, Larry. That's actually a perfect segue to go back into the source sheets, because what I want to show you is that there are 3 other sources prior to the main episode in Exodus 12 that we get to, which foretells that this is actually going to happen. Okay, so I love that you latched on to God and God's role in this, okay, because that's a big question for us. And in fact, we learn of this, the first time that we learn about this is in Genesis 15, the Brit Ben Habitarim, the covenant of the parts. So I want to go to that particular source now. I'm going to scroll down just a bit to pull that up. Okay, so remember in Genesis 15, God turns to Avram. He's not Avraham yet, but rather Avram, and says to Avram the following: know well that your offspring will be strangers in a land not theirs, and they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. But I will execute judgment on the nation they will serve, and in the end they will go free with great wealth. V'gam et hagoy asher yavodu dan anochi ve'acharei ken yetzu berchush gadol. Okay, so there we have a prophecy that's given to Abraham in which he's told very clearly that his descendants will be enslaved in a strange land for 400 years. And when they come out from that place, they will come out with great wealth, or here literally great possessions. A second time that we see it is Exodus 3, toward the beginning of the book of Exodus, where we read this passage. Yet I know that the king of Egypt will let you go only because of a greater might. So I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with various wonders, which I will work upon them. After that, he will let you go. And God says very clearly, and I will dispose the Egyptians favorably toward this people, so that when you go, you will not go away empty-handed. Each woman will borrow from her neighbor, and the larger in her house objects of silver and gold and clothing. and you will put these on your sons and daughters, thus stripping the Egyptians. And the final telling that we have of this before the main episode is Exodus 11, okay, verses 2 through 3, where God turns to Moses and says to Moses the following: tell please to the people, or say to the people, each man from his neighbor and each woman from hers, borrow objects of silver and gold. The Lord disposed the Egyptians favorably toward the people. Okay, and then look at what Rashi has to say on this particular verse. Okay, this is jumping off of the two-letter Hebrew word, which is na. Okay, which please, tell please to the people to borrow. And Rashi says the following. Okay, remember Rashi is our great medieval commentator, the most prolific commentator of all of Tanakh, all of the Talmud. His dates are 1040 to 1105, Troyes, France. And Rashi writes, the word na is always an expression of entreaty. Here it means, I entreat you to admonish them about this commandment which follows, so that the righteous man Avraham may not protest, quote, the prophecy that you sent me in Genesis 15, verse 13, they will serve them and they will afflict them, unquote, God fulfilled. But the promise of Genesis 15:14, they will go forward with great wealth, God did not fulfill. Okay, so what is Rashi's main concern here?
Matt?
Well, his concern is that the whole thing ties back to Abraham, that it had to be completed. What I'm thinking is, did the source that wrote that part of Genesis write this part of Shemot, the JEPD stuff?
Right. Most likely the answer to that is yes, Matt. And
Okay.
I would say that part of what Rashi is so concerned about here is God's reputation, right? He is concerned about the prophecy that was given to Abraham, right? But very, very specifically is, what is God going to look like if the prophecy isn't complete, if it's not fulfilled word for word? Toby.
I have a question about the repeated use of the word borrow, because clearly whatever is happening, whether it's looting or they're being, given stuff to get them out of there, it is not a borrowing. They are leaving. And if they said borrow on the pretense that they were just going out for 3 days and would be coming back, then that would be a deception on top of the looting or whatever we want to call it. I don't know what the Hebrew is, but the word is consistently borrow.
Right. No, absolutely. And what I want to say to that, Toby, is that is a huge question for us. Right, this whole bit, how is it that we understand that, vayashilu, and what is the root of that Hebrew word? Matt Weiss, I know you're a big fan of that column in Hadassah magazine,
It's
in which they love to talk about Hebrew. Excellent,
Yes.
Okay. Excellent, very, very good, okay? So vayashilu, right, is right to borrow. But that same root, shin aleph lamed, is also connected to she'elah, which is asking. Okay, so Toby, I think it's very, very poetic that is a major question for us, right? And at the very, very end, when we get to the finish line here, you'll see how Aviva Zornberg, one of my favorite teachers of Torah in Jerusalem, will go full circle connecting questions and borrowing, right? And what that means for us. Okay, so I want you to hold on to that, but definitely it's a major, major question for us, because certainly, it's It's borrowing over the long term. This is like a mortgage that we're talking about. They're leaving the country and
Right.
they're not going back anytime soon. Diane Wall.
No, I have no, no comments, but I can't see everything because it's not lifted all the way. I can't see everything.
Okay, I'll make sure to scroll.
Yeah, I think we just
Okay,
need you to
good.
scroll that up a little bit for us.
Yes, okay, I will do that. Let's
And
go
actually,
back.
Reva, did you have a question? Oh, wait, you're muted. Okay, it got answered.
Okay, great. Okay, so I want to take you to a very, very famous Talmudic source, which shows you how much of a shanda this episode has been to the Israelites and Jewish people throughout the ages. Okay, this comes to us from Talmud Tractate Sanhedrin 91a. Okay, I'm going to pull up the English. Hopefully it will be, whoop, come on. Hopefully it will be high enough so that you can all see it. Okay, it's jumping. But you see once again, the Egyptians. Yes, great. Okay. Once again, the Egyptians came to present their case against the Jews to Alexander the Great. They pleaded, okay, this is the Egyptians coming to Alexander and they are pleading their case, and look at what they claim before Alexander. Is it not written, quote, they lent them gold, etc.? Then return to us the gold and silver that you took. Okay, here you go, Toby, it's perfect. Okay, so many, many hundreds of years later, along come the Egyptians to Alexander the Great, and they say that they want to bring a case against the Israelite people, against the Jewish people, right? You said that you were borrowing these things. Okay, well, it's payback time. Now return all of that gold and silver. Thereupon, Gibeah ben Pesisa said to the sages, quote, give me permission to go and plead against them before Alexander the Great. Okay, that is plead against the Egyptians. Should they defeat me, then say, quote, you have defeated an ignorant man among us, and should I prevail, then say the law of Moses has defeated you, unquote. So the sages, the rabbis, gave this particular attorney or barrister permission, and he went and he pleaded against the Egyptians. He said to them, from where do you have proof? And the Egyptians replied, from the Torah. Then I too, Gibeah ben Pesisa replied, I too will bring proof from the Torah. Now the sojourn of Israel was 430 years. Pay us for the toil of 600,000 men who you enslaved for 430 years. Alexander said to them, answer him. Give us 3 days' time, they begged. So he gave them respite. They sought and they found no answer. Okay, so what is this particular Talmudic story about? What do we understand from this? What is it coming to teach us, Toby? And then Reva?
Well, it's the answer to why did the Israelites take all this stuff, that it was repayment for the 430 years of enslavement. And when you multiply 430 years by 600,000 men,
Excellent,
it's
right.
very minimal payment.
Okay, so this shows you very, very clear. Actually, before I say this, I want to go to Reva. Reva, just take yourself off mute. Thank you.
Toby is channeling me today, so she already.
Okay, terrific. Okay, next time I pick on Reva before I pick on Toby. So,
I think
okay.
Stanley had his hand up. We just need you to unmute, Stanley.
My question, wasn't this wealth used in the building of the ark eventually?
So most likely, right, it was not only used in the building of the golden calf, but also in the building of the ark as well.
So that
Right.
would be, that's like the Torah is justifying, I mean, that's pretty important.
No, so what the rabbis are doing here, okay, is they are they are saying that what happened was absolutely just. And the way they're doing that is saying essentially that these were reparations for 430 years of enslavement in Egypt. Right? That's the argument that's being made here. Clearly, it's giving you a sense that the rabbis realize that this is a blight on the Israelites. Right? The episode itself is a blight on the Jews. Just it's going back to where we began with Nancy's comment, right? That this is very, very uncomfortable for us, right? And it is the case that all throughout history, right, non-Jews have pointed to this as, right, theft, right? This is, pilfering. That's what we're talking about here, right? So the rabbis are making the argument, don't read it as that, read it as reparations. That's how we all need to understand it. Shelley.
So when Diane was speaking, and I believe it was Diane, she was talking about how it came back to them and bit them with the building of the golden calf. And at the time I was thinking, following up on the last person who was speaking, is that it's a lesson in what you do with what you're given. So yes, it was used to build the golden calf. And yes, those people were punished, but also many women refused to give it, which is why we have Rosh Chodesh and we celebrate that. And the same stuff was used in the building, had to have been used in the building of the ark. So what you're given, what you actually do with it can go to both good or bad, and it shows the kind of person you are. It doesn't, the whole story and the comparison doesn't lump all of the Israelites into one pot, as they say.
Right, excellent, Shelley. As you were talking, I was thinking of, one of the questions that comes up, thank God it doesn't come up frequently in the world of philanthropy, but what happens when an institution, an organization receives a gift that's as a result of ill-gotten gain, right? What do we do in that case? And there was a very famous episode in the history of JTS where that happened. There was a pledge made, and ultimately JTS refused that gift. It was a gift that was specifically given to rename the library at JTS. And so, one asks the question, where are, ethics and principles come into play, right? I agree with you that in terms of one's wealth, how you use that wealth is certainly a statement of your values. And I think it's very, very beautiful that we have the counterbalance to, Egel HaZahav through the Mishkan, right? Through the tabernacle. That's
Can I just say one thing, Shelley? I happen to agree with you. Not everybody had that kind of feeling with the, going to do the golden calf. There are always so many, hopefully more, that care more about doing right than doing something at the moment. But I love listening to you, Shelley. It's terrific. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Diane. Okay, I want to take you into more opinions on what it is that we're looking at. I'm pulling up our source sheet again. Okay, we go from the Talmud to Josephus. Okay, Josephus is the Roman Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century. His dates are 37 to 100. And here's what Josephus writes in Antiquities. The Egyptians honored them with these gifts in order to hasten their departure, and others out of good neighborliness and the friendship they bore to them. When they went forth, the Egyptians wept and suffered remorse for the way they had ill-treated them. Right? So Josephus is essentially saying that the Egyptians had an interest in getting rid of the Israelites as quickly as possible. Right? At this point, they were a thorn in the side of Egypt, and they just wanted to urge them on. Right? And one way to urge them on was to give them wealth and just get them out of here as quickly as possible. Mechilta Bo, which is a collection of midrashim. Look at what it says here. God gave the people favor or grace, chen, in the eyes of the Egyptians, that they let them have what they asked for. Literally so. Before they could make their request, the offer was forthcoming, this is the view of Rabbi Ishmael. In other words, the Egyptians were exceedingly generous with the Israelites, right? Even before they had a chance to ask for the gift, right? They were there with a fruit basket for them, right? Giving it to them, telling them, just take it, be off. Ibn Yanach, okay, number 11, or Ibn Janach, 990 to 1055, Spanish rabbi, grammarian, physician. He writes the following: but every woman will borrow of her neighbor, that she should give her as a gift. The same applies to the text, and let every man borrow of his neighbor. Should it be argued that the text merely speaks of borrowing and not of freely giving, we can cite Hannah's statement, I have lent him to the Lord, where the same Hebrew verb is used and where it is impossible to explain it in any other sense, but that she, Hannah, had given the prophet Samuel, right, Samuel at his birth, as a gift to the Lord. God had never asked her to loan him, but she had freely willed him as a gift. Okay, I mentioned Ibn Janach was also a very, very famous grammarian, and he's turning to another book of the Hebrew scriptures, the book of Samuel, right, to prove that the same Hebrew root, right, this business of she'ilah, right, or she'iltihu, right, borrowing, is in the context of giving, right? It's clear that Hannah gives her child to God, doesn't just merely lend her child to God. So he uses that to reinforce this notion that it's not borrowing that we're talking about here, right? Even though it seems that that's the pshat of the word itself, but rather it's borrowing in the sense of giving. And then Rashbam, right, who again reinforces this notion of giving. Okay, Rashbam is the grandson of Rashi, 1085 to 1158, also France. He writes, every woman will ask as an irrevocable and outright gift. See Psalm 2, I will give the nations of your inheritance. This is the plain sense and a refutation of the heretics. And the Lord gave the people favor to give them in the form of a gift so that they let them have what they asked for. The Israelites were the askers, and the Egyptians gave them for the asking as a gift. Okay, I want to pause here for a moment for any comments or questions that you have on any of these commentaries.
I do have a question because with you I learn, and I just want to compliment everybody that comes that has such wonderful knowledge. But then I was just thinking, okay, here the Egyptians said, okay, we had all these curses, you know, take our wealth and goodbye. But then wasn't it that they realized that they can't go any very, very far because there is a, you know, all this water and they cannot move. So we're going to get back everything we gave them anyway. So let them feel secure that we're being so nice. They suffered for so long. And here they'll believe that, oh my God, they really truly believe that God is so powerful. Everything's going to be great. They're going to be bereft of a lot of wealth that makes them very, very happy. And then they come after them, and then the waters open, and so many of them, you know, are killed. And we walk away, you know, still with the wealth. And as far as I'm concerned, when people suffer like we suffered, that was the least that they could have done for us, because they could never give us back the lives that we lost.
Right. Very, very interesting, Diane. So, right, you're much more skeptical about all of this, and maybe it was manipulation on the part of the Egyptians, knowing full well, right, that they weren't going to get very far, right, and ultimately all of that wealth would come back to the Egyptians in the end. Right, this was a ploy to just get them out as quickly as possible, right, and then to recoup, right, their wealth eventually. Riva.
Well, I always have to laugh when I think of when my father visited Egypt and they watched some kind of a nighttime show over the pyramids, and they were told that the pyramids were built by willing workers. Well, maybe not exactly, but if you want to give the Egyptians a little bit of credit, or at least perhaps some of the people did have a more ethical, moral heart. And perhaps they felt that they knew what they did over these 400 years was not right. And so this was their retribution. They really owed these people, and then maybe they were trying to make amends, and perhaps only because they were afraid of the Hebrew God. But maybe it was more than that. Maybe it was just knowledge that, we've not been our best selves.
Right. Excellent, Riva. I love that you're pointing out, we can't paint a whole people with broad brushstrokes, right? Never, right? And even the Egyptians, who, don't come off looking so well in the Hebrew scriptures, right? And, within that population, absolutely, I want to believe there were those with good hearts and those that recognize the justice involved in reparations, or at least, giving something to their slaves, their servants who were departing. Toby.
Well, obviously, I'm going to agree with what Riva said. I also wanted to add that, it uses the word neighbor, which implies a degree of acquaintanceship among the Israelites with the people that they took the goods from. And I want to question whether those were the people who had actually enslaved the Israelites, because they were really the slaves to Pharaoh, working on the pyramids, working on building Pharaoh's cities. It wasn't like, probably wasn't, at least we're not told that it was, that they were, house slaves to Egyptians or anything like that. So, there's probably more, or at least before the plagues came, there was probably more friendship between the Israelites and the kind of common or everyday Egyptians than a master-slave relationship.
Beautiful. Look, as you're talking, Toby, I was thinking, I love that you're pointing out this whole business of neighbor, right? And we know that in general, people give to people, right? And that relationship is very important. So it's not surprising that they would be commanded, right, to ask of their neighbors, right, of people that know them and that would be more willing to give, as it were.
Philip, then Stanley, then Shelley.
Go ahead. Yeah, hi. I'm just, thank you for having me, first of all. It's nice to be here.
Pleasure.
Thank you. So what I'm thinking about actually doesn't really relate so much to what has been said before, though everything that's been said is so beautiful. But I'm thinking about that this was a culture of genocide. And let's not forget that originally they were out to kill Jewish children. Now, I don't know how one can compare that to the reparations that come later. But there's some play in here. And as I think back on Jewish history, I think this is an anomaly. I don't think that that's really what happens to the Jewish people over the next 2,000 years or whatever. So it's an interest, I think, what happened then and what we're struggling with is a difficulty about, what happened in the Torah and then what really happens to us as a people throughout the generations.
Right. Excellent, Philip. The obvious parallel or connect that I was making as you were talking is, right, what it is that happens, right, during the Shoah, after the Shoah, communities that were destroyed, people who, and obviously you hear a lot about art that was taken from, families of Jewish collectors and, and you're absolutely right about that. It seems that what we're reading here in Torah is an anomaly. And especially with the establishment of the state of Israel, right? Jews who were living in, Iraq, Egypt, North African, in Muslim countries were forced to leave without anything, right? And were never given any sort of reparations when they left, right? They left with, basically the shirt on their back and, arrived in Israel destitute. So you're absolutely right in saying that, what we have here is, maybe, in a way, it's like this Jewish fantasy that we're reading about here. The fact that, they would just offer their riches to us on, as we, but it is fascinating to think about how this notion of loss and reparations hangs over us as a people at, various points of our history. Thank you for raising that. Carolyn, who's next?
Stanley and then Shelley. Just need you to unmute, Stanley.
Oh yeah, I just find there's an interesting parallel between this and what has gone on in the United States, because the question of reparations to African Americans, to Blacks, has been raised in the United States, and it's met with a lot of negative comments, and hasn't really gone anywhere. So I just find that an interesting parallel.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, Stanley, because I've got an article that I'm going to send to all of you precisely on this topic, written by Rabbi Aryeh Bernstein, about the Torah argument for reparations to African Americans. It's a fascinating piece, and it jumps off of a lot of the sources that we're discussing over this hour, and I think you'll find it really enriching. So I think, Carolyn, we're going to send out the link, or we could actually send out the actual article.
I mean, I think we can do both.
Okay, good.
Shelley and then Naomi.
So I'm asking, what is the word for neighbor, and where is it seen in the text?
The word for neighbor is shachen. And I will tell you in a moment where it is that you see it in the text, Shelley. Okay, in Exodus 3, verses 19 through 22, this is source 5. 3 lines down, it says, V'sha'ala isha mishchenta. Okay, and you see in that mishchenta, shachen or shchena. Okay, so that's the word that's used for neighbor. Okay, it's translated here as each woman will borrow from her neighbor.
So what I'm wondering is, historically, if this happened at all, but if it did happen, and let's just say that it did, they're living in Goshen, and they have become slaves, and they've been slaves for all these years. Everybody who lost their property during the time of Joseph became a slave. They were basically making reparations for having been fed to begin with, which was how they got hooked into slavery. I'm wondering, did the Israelites, were they the only ones that became slaves? And how is it that of all times in the history, Israelites would be living side by side with Egyptians in an area that would be held, that was kept by slaves? And how would these neighbors be their neighbors? Like, I'm wondering how this is even possible.
Right. It's a great question. I wish I had the answers to all of the fine questions that you're posing, Shelley. It's simply great that you can ask the questions. I think we're incapable of answering.
And one more question. How would these neighbors be wealthy neighbors? I mean, living next to a hovel, let's say. That's in my other question. Okay, I see that you can't answer it, but that's my other thought.
Right. We do connect the Israelite enslavement to a period in Egypt that was characterized by an invasion by what's called the Hyksos. Right? These are people that came from most likely somewhere in what we call Israel today, somewhere in that area, and that were used as slave labor. Okay, and their Egyptian hieroglyphs, right, document this invasion of the Hyksos, these foreigners who actually rose to power in Egypt initially and then became enslaved. And so it's believed that the Israelites and the Hyksos overlap with each other. As far as the realia of, where they were living and how they were living, that's something that that will always remain a mystery to us. Naomi?
Well, I just wanted to build up on something that Shelley sort of intimated. And I think that in reading all of these things, we have to keep in mind that this is not necessarily historically accurate stuff that we're reading, but it is a tremendous literary value and moral and philosophical value. And trying to, just get everything down to the nitty gritty of, did this really happen? It's things that might, and the drashas are more trying also to interpret these things that are essentially ambiguous and that nobody ever really knows the historical truth of.
Right. Excellent point, Naomi. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I want to take us back into the sources because I'm very, very aware of the pressure of time. And we move on to Chizkuni, source number 13. Chizkuni is also a French commentator from the 13th century, rabbi and commentator of Torah. And here's what he says. You will not go empty-handed, right? This is God speaking, because they will endow you with gratuity of three kinds, silver, gold, and clothing, as in the case of a master's farewell to his servant, which was taken from the flock, threshing floor, and winepress. Every woman will ask as an outright gift, gold and silver, in place of the houses, fields, and movables the Israelites left behind. Right, very, very, very interesting. Two very interesting things here. Right, one is that what Chizkuni does is he places it in the context of the laws that come later in the book of Devarim, in the book of Deuteronomy, as to how Israelites should treat servants and slaves that are freed. Right? You never let a servant or slave go away empty-handed. Right? You want to be sure that you're planting the seeds for their future. And in addition, what Chizkuni is saying is that they were given the gold and the silver in place of the real estate that they were leaving behind, things that they couldn't carry out of the country, right? So perhaps the Egyptians were able to cash in on what the Israelites were leaving behind. Okay, source number 14, a collection of midrash called Chemdat Hayamim. And look at what this states. Very, very interesting. Every woman will ask her neighbor. Why was this instruction given to the women? Because Pharaoh had decreed that every newborn male be cast into the Nile. The daughters of Israel bribed Pharaoh's officials and the Egyptians with their jewelry to look the other way. The result was that they drowned some of their male children and let others survive. This is why the text does not record that they threw every child into the Nile. God therefore gave instructions that every woman ask her neighbor back for what had been taken in bribes. No deception was involved. It was only restitution. Okay, very, very interesting perspective, right? That it was measure for measure, midah keneged midah. This was sort of leveling the playing field, right? Because the Israelite women had to bribe Egyptians so as to protect their sons. So now it was coming back on them, and they were asking for those bribes in return. Beno Jacob, 1862 to 1945, a German rabbi and Bible scholar, writes that the Torah records that the Egyptians and Jews parted as friends, the former liberally furnishing them with gifts, as the latter themselves had bidden in the case of sending their own Hebrew servants. Since the Egyptians could not be expected to offer gifts of their own initiative, Israel was bidden to spur them to do it and say to them, let us part as friends and we'll take with us a parting gift. Okay, so Beno Jacob wants to convey this sense of peace and amity as they left Egypt. Umberto Cassuto, another modern Bible scholar, 1883 to 1951, began his life in Italy, ended up becoming a professor of Bible at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He writes, the Hebrew slaves had worked for their masters for a number of years. They were entitled to their freedom and to their statutory farewell gifts. The law, or rather absolute justice, demanded it. Though the latter does not exist in the world, the court on high sees to its implementation, directing the course of events accordingly. Right? That the way of the world is ultimately bending toward justice, is an arc of justice. And finally, before we go to your voices, I want to turn to this very beautiful passage of Aviva Zornberg. Okay, and I alluded to this before. Here's what she writes. The act of borrowing, ha'amek davar, this is one of our very famous commentators of Torah, suggested, was the cause of the chipazon, the confused haste of the Exodus. Right? She's saying that, right, the act of borrow, this whole shady episode that we've been talking about is the reason that the Israelites departed Egypt hastily. Because they asked the Egyptians for silver and gold, the redemption took place in a certain anxiety, a nighttime flurry, lest the Egyptians regret it. It is this that generates tension in the people's experience of the Exodus. It is striking, on the other hand, that the expression she'ela mi invariably means to ask for an outright gift. In other words, the concept of she'ela, question or request, introduces notions of instability. To ask is in itself to raise questions of meaning. Is this a gift or is this a loan? Often only the context will help in interpretation. In the reading of Ha'amek Davar, the She'elah is assumed by the Egyptians to be a loan, while the narrative and God in commanding the She'elah couches it in the form of an outright gift. I am suggesting that if, in the same narrative, questions and gifts or loans are referred to by the same word, this is not without significance. In both cases, the Torah speaks of desire, the commanded desire for silver and gold articles, and the desire of those who have forgotten for what they no longer know. Observations, comments, questions. I will say, whenever you read a passage of Aviva Zornberg, you need to read it multiple times before you truly understand it, right? One of the interpretations that I want to highlight based on Aviva is, number one, I love what she says about different perspectives of the same act. Right? So what was for the Egyptians, what they understood as an act of borrowing, Toby, okay? For the Hebrews, they understood it as gift giving. Right? That's what was going, so it was a clash of perspectives, right? So indeed, the Egyptians could have felt that they were just simply borrowing all of this, right? And the Israelites, b'tmimut, in their innocence, just saw this as gifts. Diane?
Yeah, so when you have a loan, whether it's from a bank, from a family or something, so that means that eventually you are going to pay it back. But here, these people were leaving, going to another area. Was this something that was then going to be put on generations of the families that left, that the Egyptians, no matter where people lived and eventually came together, would then reclaim this loan that, like in the story of Alexander the Great? I mean, were they going to follow them somehow like a shadow over the next 100 years in order to get this payback? So when you think of the word alone, alone is something that you pay back, and in many cases, you're added extra money for not paying back the loan on time. So it's
Thank
interesting.
you. Thank you. Riva.
I'm sorry. There's some element in there that the Israelites were a little bit confused because they'd been enslaved for over 400 years. So this generation, they really knew not what they had given up because they had never known freedom. So in asking for perhaps reparation for what they had been taken from them, did they really quite understand? They knew nothing but slavery.
Yeah. No, I think it's an excellent observation. It's not so easy to make the transition from, a life of enslavement to freedom. And we know that not only from the Israelite experience, we know that well from, experiences in modern day like Iraq, other countries that, free themselves from dictatorship. Freedom is a precious gift. And so there's this shock in the immediate moments of freedom. How are we going to behave? Right. And, are we going to behave as, free, ethical people, or are we going to behave like our oppressors? And so this is, it's not black or white here. There are many shades of gray in this episode. And, it lends itself to many, many questions, as Aviva is pointing out.
Naomi and then Diane Trotterman.
Well, I just, I really am enjoying this thought that we're talking about, because that there have always been cultural differences between people's understandings of words and actions, such as whether it's a loan and as a gift. And this has troubled us down for many centuries. But it's also interesting in how the jurisprudence as we know it today has changed based on a lot of these things. For instance, in terms of contract law, if there is some sort of a borrowing or a lending in basic contracts these days, is if it's over a certain amount of money, it must be in writing and really quite clarified. So these problems have been with us from time immemorial, and it's just a lot of fun to philosophically review them from time to time. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question for Matt, and Harold keeps asking me this question. I don't think that we were enslaved after Joseph. Somebody said we came down to Egypt, Joseph. I don't know how many years passed between Joseph's time and when a Pharaoh knew not Joseph. Would you say hundreds of years?
It's a great question. And all I can say, Diane, is that Nahum Sarna himself, one of the greatest Bible commentators, says that it's impossible to know how many years. We could be talking about a century, or we could be talking potentially about hundreds of years that pass.
So the reason I ask is it seems that wherever we go, we're very industrious. There must have been wealth accumulated by the Jews, by the Hebrews, or whatever you call them, during this time when Joseph was there, who was beloved by the Egyptian, so to speak, and we have no idea when they actually all were formed into this slave class. But I'm thinking to myself that perhaps there were things that were theirs, beautiful things, that were then taken away from them by the Egyptians.
Yes.
And that within the families, they knew that. And that in itself was a reason that they could just, when they left, take the jewelry and everything else. Right. I mean, I'm thinking even now with the Holocaust and the art, when you say,
you're reminding me
so many years later, and we're still doing that. We're still getting it back.
Diane, my absolute favorite history book of all time is Amos Elon's The Pity of It All, in which he tells the story of the Jews of Germany up until the Holocaust. right? And he shows how they were affluent and successful and, reached the heights of German culture in every which way, right? And precisely, right, it's what you're describing, right? How all of that ends up being taken away from them, but it happens so gradually, right? So slowly, they don't even recognize that it's happening to them. And I believe it's the same pattern that we see playing out here in Shmot. We don't think about it like that, but I love what you just did, sort of projecting that onto the reality of what the Israelites experienced in Egypt. It makes complete sense because, Joseph rose to the heights of power in Egypt, right? And clearly the Israelites did well for themselves. And that was Pharaoh's fear.
So Aviva Zornberg, in the very last sentence, when she says, and what they did not know, is that just a reference to going forward? Or could it be a reference to what had happened?
I think what she means by that is, again, she's making this bridge between she'ilah and she'elah, okay, between the borrowing and the questions. So one deals with the borrowing of material possession, the commanded desire for silver and gold articles, and she'ilah, questions, the desire of those who have forgotten for what they no longer know, right? So I think it's an allusion to question. I think she's trying to tie the ribbon and bring it all together in this last sentence. I believe that's what's happening here. Carolyn.
I think we could percolate all of the thoughts that were brought up today for another hour or so, but our time has come to an end for this session. Thank you so much for participating. Two things I want to bring to your attention. We did put that link in the chat bar for the article that Rabbi mentioned. We will send it out shortly to your email, though, also, if you're not able to access that at the same time. We will be meeting again next Thursday, and for the next 5 weeks after that for sure. There'll be a new Zoom link in your email for that. I again want to say, take a look at the JTS webpage of upcoming events. In particular, Monday afternoon's class that's in our Lunch and Learn series might really pique the interest of some of you. It's some unexpected stories about women in Talmud. Judith Hauptman is the instructor for that. And actually one of our class members, Toby Deutsch, is sponsoring that class next week. So it's really a joy to be with you all. The best part—
I also do want to mention that there are two wonderful sessions that are coming up next week and then about a week and a half after that. JTS received a wonderful grant from Nefesh B'Nefesh this year to do Israel programming online. And so next week, in honor of Tu B'Shvat, we're going to have two Israeli environmentalists, Yosef Abramowitz and Alon Tal, who are going to be talking about sustainability in Israel. It should be a very, very animated conversation. And then the following session, which you will not want to miss, is Yossi Klein Halevi, who is going to be talking about Israeli music during the time of Corona. Yossi's great passion, apart from his remarkable books on Israeli history and politics and his wonderful insights, is he loves music and particularly loves Israeli music. So you'll be able to experience another wonderful side of Yossi Klein Halevi if you join us for that. And I will be sure, this is a special invitation to everyone sitting in this Beit Midrash. So Carolyn and I will be sure that those invitations get out to you.
Absolutely.
Our pleasure.
Thank you. Great to see everyone this morning.
Wishing you Shabbat Shalom. Take care. Be well.
Take it easy.
Thank you again.
Another great session.
Thank you, Diane.